Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? No? My name's Ethan Levinson, and I work in the Public Programs Department here at YIVO. As some of you may know, YIVO is a research institute, an institution of higher learning, an adult education institute, a cultural organization, and a world-renowned library and archives. The YIVO archives contain some 23 million items, including sound and music collections, theater and art collections, communal and personal records, photographs and films, manuscripts, memoirs, personal correspondences, and much more. The YIVO's library has nearly 400,000 volumes in all European languages and contains the largest collection of Yiddish language books, pamphlets, and newspapers in the world. We are so pleased to celebrate the publication of Mark Slocum's new book, Motor City Music, here at YIVO. We are also offering a special discounted price for those of you who may be interested in purchasing such a copy. And for a brief introduction of Mark Slocum is the Winslow Kaplan Professor of Music at Wesleyan and the author or editor of many books on Afghani and Central Asian music, Eastern European Jewish music, film music, and ethnomusicology theory, two of which have received the ASCAP Games Taylor Award, Fiddler on the Move, Exploring the Klezmer World, and Tenement Songs, popular music of the Jewish immigrants. He is the president of the Society for Ethnomusicology and the Society for Asian Music, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Mark is also the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Foundation of Jewish Culture. Please join me in welcoming Mark Slocum.
Is this okay? Is this okay for everybody back there? Great. Well, I'm delighted to be at YIVO. I've been connected to YIVO for 45 years, and this is the first book talk I've given here. And maybe that's because this is a general audience book, and so I think it has a little kind of wider reach in a sense. It also has a wider reach because it's not a book just about Jews. It's a book about music in the city of Detroit when I grew up there. I'm a native Detroiter. I was born in 1943, and just a word about Detroit so you understand the context for this. I partly got into this because people don't understand Detroit. They have been exposed to it as this classic example of American ruin and destruction, and the beautiful ruins have been you see them everywhere, and the bankruptcy, the largest bank, and nobody knows how it got that way, and nobody seems to remember what it used to be. And I say, by talking to people and saying, no, I got interested in my own place, and then I realized that the music of Detroit is very badly studied and written about, except for Motown. Everything else happened in that city. So when I was born, it was the middle of World War II. This was the arsenal of democracy, according to Franklin Roosevelt. It turned out there was one factory, converted auto truck factory, that turned out one bomber every hour. So it was the fourth largest city in America when I was a kid. It was called the capital of the 20th century by cultural theorists for the evolution of the assembly line and the centralization of industry and Henry Ford. Nobody kind of remembers this anymore because of the disinvestment, the racism, the way capitalism works. The place was essentially abandoned and also demonized in a certain kind of way. But that's another story. In my day, it was the great place. So this is about Detroit in its heyday, and I tried to cover all the music I could get my hands on in Detroit, amongst which was my community, the Jews. So in the book has a few chapters, and every chapter has a metaphor based on traffic, because that's Detroit. The people built the cars, they drove them. And the overarching theme of the book is that music is like traffic. It flows from neighborhoods out into central places, to places of work, and it has a mobility about it that is not the fences, the borders, the policing, and whatever else was going on, and the riots. After I was born, it was a massive riot in 1943, and the book kind of ends around the great 1967 rebellion, as it's called these days, or uprising. It's the only city in America occupied 3 times by the U.S. Army. So this is not an easy city. It was also the most anti-Semitic city in America, I think, between Henry Ford, who, as you know, paid for the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and Father Coughlin, the virulent horrifying radio priest who was based in Detroit, and every week was broadcasting to millions of Americans about how bad the Jews were. And then there was like the Michigan Legion, the KKK types who apparently once plotted to blow up all the synagogues in America on Yom Kippur. This is Michigan. So the Jewish community held a very particular position. There were 90,000 Jews when I was a kid, and it was they all lived in one neighborhood. There were no suburbs yet. So that's the city I'm talking about. I'm going to extract, some of the story of the Jews there and read you, some sections about that from 2 points of view. The Jews take their role in this book in 2 parts. First of all, me and my family. It's a Jewish family. It's maybe not a typical Jewish family. There was no such thing. The Jews were across an immense range of experience and taste and things like that, and political meaning. But nevertheless, I start with myself and the family as a way of getting into the city. And then I spread out the whole thing, and I come back as a voice all the way through the book. What happened in my junior high, what was the music like? What happens in classical music and what I did. And then I spread out this canvas. So there is a chapter on the Jews, the Jewish community itself, because I found them particularly interesting in telling the story of the city. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the beginnings and the personal part. I won't show you all the pictures of me there are 50 pictures in this book. The first ones are me and my family, and there's me at age 4, and I'm telling that story very deliberately about a half-immigrant family. My father was born in Detroit. His mother was born in New York in 1890. So I'm a third-generation Yankee on that side. And my mother was an immigrant from South Ukraine, from Uman. It was a refugee. And they were refugees to Romania in 1921 and came from Chisinau to America. Probably know. We can make a connection. This is Jewish geography. And she came to in 1922 to Detroit and met my father, and that became the history. Let me start a little with that. I'd rather use this mic and not be quite so far away. The first chapter of the book is called Construction Sites. And I explain, in any big city, hold on, the dust jacket is flying away. In a big city, each individual is a construction site, a cluttered set of cones and signals, detours and pedestrian walkways. Behind the noise and grit, something is getting built, often at intersections. So this metaphor of the construction site is the personal. To visit this pulsating, dense city, for me, the surest place to start is my family, the richest source I have for how music lives in Detroit. At home, on the road, in the car, or even abroad. We spent a year in Europe when I was 10 years old, which was very formative. Songs and symphonies created my consciousness. It was all heavily European, but also deeply American. It was far from typical, no family is, but I shared a common experience in having a wide variety of sources and influence, many from beyond Detroit. I should say it was a city of immigrants more than any other American city in the sense that it was very small until 1910. It doubled from 1910 to 20. It doubled from 1920 to 30, and almost again of 1940 because of the draw of the auto industry. So it was a city much more than Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Chicago, with of newcomers, really huge amounts of newcomers. The Europeans, like my people, actually were there earlier than the blacks and whites from the South who came to work in the most often. And eventually in the auto industry and then during the war industries. So everybody was kind of figuring out who they were, and that's another big topic. So we were all trying to figure out who we were. We knew we were from Uman. That was very clear, and we began to develop that we developed that very strongly as an identity. A little bit about the family. I start with my aunt, and then my father, Norval, and my brother, Dan, and what they told me and what I know about their musical lives. I'll just a word about Aunt Anne, because her story will bring us to something I'm going to do at the end. She arrived in 1922 with my mother as a child, having survived pogroms through Ellis Island. But then she got very Americanized, and they sent her to Camp Machaya. And I found among her things she gave me her favorite songs from Camp Machaya. So this is kind of, the construction. Her construction site is typical because immigrants all are American and, newcomers at the same time. So you find them singing over hill, over dale, as we hit the dusty trail. You find them singing all kinds of Jewish songs. And they are singing the Erie Canal, and they're singing German vaudeville songs and English ballads. And then, of course, she sings these classic Yiddish songs that many of you know, which I put in the book because I love them so much. And because they talk about the collective of construction, like dem Feuer bis aus den Liebe, die Nacht ist Tage, lass wir singen Lieder, und so das Feuer verwaschen werden, scheint aus der Himmel mit seinen Sternen. This is a kind of leftist song. It's a campfire song. You sang it around the campfire. And it says, we're sitting around the campfire. Okay? And it says, and if the fire burns out, we have the stars, and we're dreaming of the future.
We can't hear you.
We're weaving dreams. Oh, sorry. Okay, I have to clip this very closely. So, Ahum Dem Fire is that kind of a camp song, which is a Jewish communal song, and it's very un-American in that sense, but it's very American, because you're around a campfire, and you're singing together, and everybody's had this experience with it. And then the nostalgic, sentimental Yiddish songs like So sein, als ich boi in der Luft meine Schlösser, so sein, als mein Glück ist im Ganzen nicht da. In Träum ist mir heller, in Träum ist mir besser. In Träumen der Himmel ist bläuer wie blau. In Träum ist mir heller, in Träum ist mir besser. In Träumen der Himmel is bläuer wie bläu. And that's, maybe I'm just building castles in the air, maybe my luck just isn't there. In my dreams, things are better. In my dreams, the sky is bluer than blue. So this is a song of nostalgia, of regret, and it encompasses a lot of Jewish kind of feeling, although in a sense it's a universal song as well. And I'll just mention, because I'm going to circle this at the end later, I think, when she was still in her 20s in 1945, on one day's notice, she took a boat to Germany and ran a DP camp, even before the Joint and the U.S. Army got there. She had this extraordinary experience for a young person doing something like that. And she kept some notes on that, including a handwritten version of a Holocaust song that I'm not sure, I haven't actually run into it elsewhere. I've asked people about it. And she doesn't have the melody, but the text is, Die ganze Welt ist mehr nicht wie ein Meißele. Die ganze Welt ist mehr nicht wie ein Spiel. In Ballade von Hunger und Neud, in Ballade von zerrissener Schicht, in Ballade was endigt sich nicht. So the whole world is no more than a fairy tale. The whole world is no more than a game. A ballad of hunger and need. A ballad of torn shoes. A ballad that never ends. So this is an American, a European girl born as an American coming to Europe to reacquaint herself with Europe and to impose a kind of order on Europe as an American. These are the complicated stories of Detroiters. There were a lot of what they called DPs in our days, and we call them refugees now, or displaced persons, when I grew up. And some of them, and they brought their songs, and like the Ruth Rubin collection that we've been celebrating here at YIVO, she did those recordings, a lot of them with displaced persons who came and brought their songs. This song seems to be kind of unique to the set. Amongst the, as far as my construction, it's very complicated, and I give some more stories about that in the book. I'll just mention one aspect of it, which is very Jewish, and I'll return to, which is the fixation on classical music. Not every house in Detroit, people, I've talked to a lot of people from childhood and people I went to high school with, from all kinds of backgrounds, to do this book. And what impresses me is how different every household was. That's why I talk about construction sites being the way they are. And a lot of people are like, no, we never, classical music, I don't know. But for the Jewish community as a whole, which I'll return to, classical music was really deeply important for their self-identity. So I grew up playing the violin and at age 4, and I talk about that. And I'll just read a little bit about this. I should say that the violin, the Jewish violin connection, is very old in Europe. You all know the fiddler who on the roof syndrome of it, the idea of the klezmer, and the idea of the violin virtuoso who came out of the ghettos of Odessa and Vilna, Yasha Heifetz, David Oistrakh, Nathan Milstein, Misha Elman. My grandmother heard Misha Elman's father in the streets of Uman, who was a klezmer, this was part of the Jewish identity and that shift in the upward mobility of the violin, but this is a long story. They took me to all these recitals. Who took me to these recitals was my Uncle Moshe. My great-uncle Morris Baker, also Moshe, this is typical too, right? Never found the time to play the violin, which he loved, but he took me to concerts of Misha Elman and Yasha Heifetz. He also made me a lifelong baseball fan by taking me to Detroit Tigers games in fabled Briggs Stadium. The Jewish baseball connection is all-American, celebrated in film and fiction. You might all have read Chaim Potuk's novel, The Chosen, for example. By combining the violin with Hank Greenberg, who was our local athlete and idol, one of the greatest ever baseball players, who refused to play at Yom Kippur during the World Series in the 1930s. Our Uncle Moshe fits right into the pattern of Europe plus America. That so constructed my consciousness. There's also a snapshot of my father fooling around with a fiddle. He was handed a violin as part of the ethnic package, but he never picked up on it, though I inherited his violin, which I recently gave to this program in Harlem that gives violins to kids who can't afford violins. So my father's old student violin, it's 100 years old, is floating around up there now. Okay. That's part of this story then is a personal story, and I want to, for a few minutes, and I'm not sure how long I should run on because there doesn't seem to be a set format for these events, but I won't run on too long. I just want to give you some sense of the Jewish community and the issues that I got interested in about them. That chapter is called Border Traffic. The Jews were enclosed in an enclave, and they trafficked across the border in music. They had their own, so there are two kinds of music I talk about in the Jewish community, the internal music, and then the music that they used for outreach and connection to the mainstream of Detroit, in a city which was rather hostile to them in many levels. They used music as, it had an ambassador function, it had a border crossing function for them. So I'm going to talk just a bit about both sides of that. The internal Jewish world, the musical world, was incredibly dense, and I sort of give different descriptions of, and then and this way that they use music as a border crossing. Internally, I'll just give you one quote from somebody I talked to. This was a very funny story. I taught at Wesleyan my whole career, and I had graduate students. One of my graduate students was a tall, lanky guy named Garrett Field. And I thought, okay, Garrett Field, he studied South Indian music. Then he said, I want to do, I said, what's your seminar paper? He said, I've always wanted a paper about this choir I sang in as a kid. I said, oh, really? Yeah, he said, it was this synagogue choir. I said, Garrett's Jewish? and I said, so where was that? He said, Detroit. I said, no, which synagogue? He said, B'nai Moshe, which is where I was bar mitzvah. I could not believe this. So he actually he wrote this up, and he actually published it in the Journal of Synagogue Music, his memoir of being a choir boy, for this cantor in Detroit, Louis Klein, who actually was one of the people I interviewed, one of the people who contributed to the History of the American Project that I did in the 1980s. So it was an amazing connection. So in his memoir, he and his brother were in this choir. And here's a quote from his memoir about this. I remember the excitement and nervousness before heading on stage when we sat with our families before the performance, like secretive spies with alternate identities. 1 second the humble and anonymous son of the Field family, and a minute later, Zan, a regular mini-cantor, belting out our sonorous renditions of traditional Jewish songs for the audience of fellow congregants. I always felt a kind of closeness to them, the other choir boys, as though we had shared an important experience, that we had done something great and exciting and special and memorable. It was a kind of secret, proud friendship and comradeship. This is really nice when you get these live accounts from people. And this speaks then very much to an internal community life that everybody had. So I'm going to do a little survey for you briefly of some of the things that I found about this. And for this I used the archive of the Detroit Jewish News, which very conveniently got digitized exactly when I was doing this research. So I could just tap in and get endless listings of things that happened. And I found it absolutely fascinating. Every faction in Detroit moved to its own beat, though the rhythms might coincide for a common communal purpose. So the programming in Yiddish, of course, was European, but everything was very mixed and eclectic because that's who Jews are. They like everything. Most Detroit Jewish balls, benefits, and concerts blended musical styles liberally, even when under the banner of a specific synagogue or social movement. Maybe it was about broadening the audience base, but this openness suited Detroit's Jews. Everyone's musical construction was a compound of European and American elements. Just to take 1947, an event at the Wayne University Hillel chapter might be called From Boogie to Bagel. A Balfour Ball Zionist event featured Roberto Rodriguez and his Latin American band, while the competing subcommunity of Yiddishists, the Shalom Aleichem Institute, also hired Panchito's Latin American Orchestra. While the classical crowd was captivated by Mr. Liszt, who, quote, held the more than 500 people spellbound with the beauty of his interpretations of charming English and German folk songs, they also enjoyed his version of the Negro spiritual, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, while being, quote, surprised and thrilled at the concluding number, Eli Eli. This touching Jewish melody was sung by Mr. Liszt with such brilliance and was so well interpreted in the spirit of Jewish traditions that many in the audience regretted that he had not included other Jewish numbers in his program. These listeners wanted it all. And so a wonderful example of this is the Jewish People's Chorus, which I sang in. So here's where I come back as a voice when I'm telling a larger story. I remember vaguely that I sang in the Jewish People's Chorus, but I didn't know anything about it, so I Googled it. Only one thing came up for Detroit Jewish People's Chorus, and it was in the Harvard University Library. It was the program of the 1958 concert in which I sang. I could not believe it. Harvard sent me a PDF immediately. And I mean, in the old days, I could never have found this.
Yeah.
But I'm able to spend some pages on what was the program and what were we doing there, which I won't give you the whole thing of. But my friend Arnie Kessler, who I see in Berkeley sometimes, who was from the Detroiter, who sang in it, said, well, you know, Mark, it was a communist front organization. I said, what? I had no idea. But by the mid-1950s, you couldn't be politically communist. It had been driven underground. So the kind of cultural front model moved in where, you know, we could do cultural stuff and still keep the leftist identity alive. So we sang all these things. I'll just, you know, give you a little bit about this concert. I should say this Detroit leftist Jewish chorus differed in no way from similar groups across America, often with a New York hub that sent out directors, composers, and musical pieces to, quote, provincial cities. You know how that worked in America, like the Jewish Actors Union. You either acted in New York or they sent you to the province. The provinces was, you know, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit. That was the province. Because that's how, you know, New York, that's how American Jews were organized. It was Detroit, it was New York, and everything else. You know, they sang everything. So let's see, I'll give you just a little of this. They sang sections from The Lonesome Train. This is a leftist thing about the classic folksy leftist thing about the death of of Abraham Lincoln. But they started with pieces by Vladimir Heifetz and Jacob Schaefer, the great New York choral guys. Then they sang Yiddish theater songs and Passover Seder tunes, and then Beethoven's Ode to Joy, followed by the Zionist song Keta Roma. And then my junior chorus came in. We started singing This Land Is Your Land and Pretty Little Gal. And then we switched to a Yiddish and a Polish folk song and a Palestine number in Yiddish, not Hebrew, rounding out with Hava Nagila, which was just starting to hit its stride as the ultimate Jewish and universal anthem of celebration. This is before intermission. After intermission, they did a huge oratorio, Von Wiegli bis Siegli, from the cradle song to the victory song by Moshe Rauch and Wolf Yunin. These are people who were very active at YIVO. This is about two children who go from World War I through their life in World War II, and then they are going to end up in Palestine triumphantly. Okay, at the end of their wanderings. So that's the Jewish People Chorus is one of those things. This internal life then was very dense. These people did not talk to each other. Even the Trotskyite groups would not talk to each other, let alone to the other Stalinists or to the Zionists. But when it came to music, again, there's this traffic thing, this integration, this flow across borders. Now, so the second section of the chapter is called Outreach. So this is the kinds of outreach that the Jews did. And this goes back to World War II, when the Detroit Jewish News starts. Okay, so I'll give you just a few things from World War II. Miss Rose Beale, Detroit songwriter and author of a number of poems, had some of her patriotic songs played in local hotels and over the radio. So here's a local Jewish girl, and she's reaching out, and she's writing patriotic songs that are being done around this. This is crossover. There were parties and dances for servicemen where Holy Name Church, downtown YWCA, League of Catholic Women, and the Jewish Welfare Board. The Odessa Progressive Aid Society, representing one of the many Landsmannschaft fraternal organizations, ran a concert for United China Relief. And there were many programs supported with the Russian war effort, like a string ensemble playing with the Detroit Russian Balalaika Orchestra, and a troupe of Russian dancers in costume. The Halevi Singing Society, which was an old Detroit concert choir, gave a program at the Veterans Hospital and made a bigger statement at a mammoth Americans All rally, where approximately 50 different nationalities, which we would call ethnic groups, taking part to promote Americanism and good fellowship and to overcome hatred and misunderstandings among various groups. So this is very explicit multiculturalism in the service of a war effort where everybody's supposed to pull together. Okay, and this is right before. This is the same year as the massive riot in Detroit, the Black-White riot. So you can see how the Jews need to be engaged with this, and what you begin to get is the round table of Catholics, Jews, and Protestants. This moment where the Jews say, "We are 1/3 of America, us 4 million people." Where there's Catholics, there's Jews, there's Protestants, and there's us. You can't do America without us. This clever move created the Interfaith Goodwill Concert of 1943. And then that organization sponsored an appearance by the Vatican Singers as part of a 99-city tour. And so in 1947, when a national organization comes to the city, who plays to represent Detroit? The Jewish Folk Chorus, alongside the Detroit Fiddlers Band, St. David's Catholic Church Choir, St. Peter and Paul's Russian Cathedral Choir, and the Detroit Lutheran A Cappella Choir. So I could go on and on with that. So this is this outreach effort, which is really struck me as something need to be said about what they were doing with music. And I'll just wrap up with the classical core, as I call it. I started on the violin, and this incredible investment in classical music. This was true in Odessa and Warsaw and Kiev and Berlin and Vienna. Everywhere you had Jews who were upwardly mobile, who were trying to become middle class and trying to identify with liberal humanism and democracy and so forth, they use classical music as a way to do that, being patrons of and then being the musicians who create, who gain respectability, the way, Black or Asian athletes, get respectability by getting to be stars. It was the music that the Jews did this in. And so Detroit Jewish News is constantly talking about this. The other counterpart newspapers that have been digitized, Boston and Cincinnati, are cities also where there was the Boston Symphony of Cincinnati, where the Jews were very invested in the classical mode. But it seemed to be even more extreme in Detroit. So they would tell you there were 30 Jewish artists in the Metropolitan Opera, a whole article. And they invited, there's a picture of the young Leonard Bernstein already in 1945, when he's just barely known, performing at the Jewish Community Center in Detroit. And at 27 years of age, he is the talk of the country, and of course, he's a Jew, right? So these kinds of moves about classical music are really important. I'll just read you one thing which I was delighted about. We went to the Detroit Symphony. It was almost like going to services. We had season tickets. My parents met their friends at the symphony concerts. It was major for us, not every family. But the Detroit Symphony was a newbies in America. It was not an old symphony. And it was at the whim of the automoguls and who would fund it. And they would occasionally just like, why are we doing this? We need a symphony here. So they would pull out their funding. Once during the war and once after the war, once when they threatened the workers, the symphony orchestra threatened to unionize, and you can imagine the response of management in Detroit. So they pulled them funding. So for a while there was no symphony. So what did the Jews do in both these cases? The first time there was none. A guy who owned Sam's Cut Rate funded it. The second time, they funded, they created, and this was two of my violin teachers were in this outfit, called the Little Symphony. And they played at the London Chop House, which was a steakhouse, a swanky steakhouse. They had small chamber concerts there. And this drove huge audiences, and people began to be this groundswell, we need our symphony back, we need our symphony back. And the Little Symphony actually created a movement that brought the symphony back. So the Jews, that's the extent to which they were deeply invested in having this role and being in the city. And then the accounts of society people coming to the opening of the symphony, and so forth, in their fur coats, and then society people hosting the Detroit Jewish performers who were famous, the concertmaster of the Detroit Symphony, Misha Mishakov, who had been the concertmaster of the NBC Symphony under Toscanini. These were bigger than life people in Detroit in general. And they were Jews, and they kept crossing the border. So I could tell a lot more about that. I'll just round out this thing with one other figure, and then I'll be able to play, I think, one little YouTube thing for you, because you need to see, oh wait, how do I get out of
Sure. This is at the bottom.
Yeah, so there's this one more, just one more figure that I mentioned, and this is Emma Shaver. Emma Shaver, who was also an immigrant kid, she was a family friend because her parents had known my grandmother or whatever in the old days. Emma Shaver had was a singer. She was a bit of a diva. She toured with opera stars. She made a tour of South America. But she's also Jewishly identified, so she crossed the border a lot. Like my Aunt Ann, with whom she was good friends, she went in the first concert, the first tour, first appearances of performers in DP camps, just like Leonard Bernstein did too, and my aunt met Bernstein there as well. Emma Shaver went to, and she stayed 6 months because she was so moved by what she saw, and she adopted a son, a little boy from the DP camp who was her son, whom I knew, Isaac Shaver. And she put out the first songbook of Holocaust songs. There's a picture of the cover in the book. Among the very first recordings. I'm just going to play a little bit of, there she is when she's young, looking very dreamy. This is, she's singing Zognet Kimo, the anthem of the resistance, of the Jewish resistance. She's singing it in a style which was familiar at the time, which has completely gone out of use now. It's very theatrical. It's very impassioned, and she sings solo and declaims it in this Russian Soviet way of declaiming songs and the Yiddish way of declamation. And then the chorus comes in too. So I just want to play a little of that because it's an early, it is I think the first recorded album of Holocaust songs. It was on 70. And then she changes to singing. Somewhat operatic, yes. Very good light. That's how they say it. With the orchestra, right? Now it sounds more like a Jewish chorus. Okay. Harmonized. Okay, so this comes around again to my family experience with my aunt, and then Emma Shaver, who was this family person we knew. So this constant connection to the European context, or to the Zionist context, this outer, sensibility of the Jews was very much there, in addition to this strong internal presence within the city. So I'm going to, I think, wrap up on that, and we have some time for some questions and thoughts that you might have about this this city. Yeah. The mic.
Detroit is known very well for the emergence of the black music scene in the 60s. Could you discuss a little bit the relationship with how the Jews and the blacks cooperated with that?
Well, nationally, the Jews exploited black talent to create their own, to create profit, and wrote the songs that black entertainers sang. That's the general story. In Detroit, this was less so the case, I would say, because Detroit is the only city where there was an African American music industry that was self-generated, and that was called Motown eventually. But yes, the cover of the book, which you're all seeing, Fortune shows Fortune Records. Fortune Records was run by a Jewish couple who sponsored many of the early R&B bands in the 50s. So usually the Jews had a managerial role. Basically, is the short answer to that question. Yeah.
Similarly, in terms of just taste of Detroit Jews and music, is there any intersection or interested in white Appalachian music or in African American blues?
Among the Jews?
Among the Jews.
Very well. There's a little section on that. There are other Jews I didn't talk about. One of them was a guy called Sid Brown, who was a little older than me, before my generation, who became a folknik and a folk rock kid. And he wrote an amazing memoir about. There's a section on the counterculture, those kids and Arnie Kessler, whom I quoted, those guys, they wanted to play mandolin and banjo, and they're the only Jewish kids I know who went into hillbilly clubs because they wanted to see how those guys really played, because they were just fooling around. And there's a nice little section on that. But by and large, they were pretty separate worlds. The vast amount of country music in the city, which I talked about, and vast amount of black music. But yes, the Jews did manage clubs. So near my house, in high school time, was a club called the Minor Key. And the Minor Key, kids that I know, the manager, his son went to the high school, and he would get the kids in. I didn't know that. I never walked into them. I talk about that, how stood at the bus stop, the minor key, to go downtown to the magnet school to play in the orchestra. I never walked into the place. It was like another world. Like, that's not my world. I'd say, oh, there'd be a sign in the window saying, Miles Davis, Yusuf Lateef this week. I never walked in. But, and then, this is why this thing about construction is so interesting, because I talked to other people and they said, we went there all the time, because, that kid brought us in and we were in. So, I talked, less technically here than in an article I wrote for Ethnomusicology about the notion of, within the city, what is shared and what is not. What is adjacent to you that you have access to? What is too remote for you? And I theorize that a little in terms of urban geography. But for the most part, kids went to jazz clubs. And usually, the black people were fine with that. They just thought, I got these kids coming in and they never get into trouble doing that. But I never thought of doing it myself. Wait, we have to use the mic, because otherwise nobody hears the question.
I might be misremembering. I grew up in Detroit a little later than you, and so theater was more than being a province. Max Fisher, theater was a Broadway shows open there. So it was different from like Cleveland or other satellite cities of New York to me, because Zero Mostel came there first. I remember Phil on the Roof.
Yeah, but that has nothing to do with the Jew.
Well, but the auto company, the people who liked musical theater, you could find, Max Fisher wasn't Jewish.
No.
Oh, that's interesting. And also Wayne State, I remember, and Mumford.
Yeah.
These high schools were distinctly cultural.
Sure.
And also very oriented to dance. And there's still a woman who's alive, Harriet Bird.
Harriet Bird, I know her.
She's a friend of mine.
I quote her.
Yeah, she's
her.
with us.
She's in her 90s, and
She's 100.
she was the dance person. She's 100 now. She was the dance person in Detroit. Harriet Bird. She was extraordinary.
JCC,
Yeah.
originally Bird.
Yeah, there's a whole section about the JCC and the cultural area. But I'll just say.
But my point being, it was originally cultural to me growing up there.
Right.
And musically in every other.
I will mention Fiddler on the Roof, though, because it's true. It premiered in Detroit. And I remember, because I was already in Ann Arbor, and this was 1962, and my parents' friends were talking, like, oh, they're doing a show at the Fisher Theater. It's about the shtetl. Why are they doing a show about the shtetl? Who wants to see that? Because from the American point of view, like, we don't talk about that. And well, is it nice for the goyim? We need a show about the shtetl. When the thing became Fiddler on the Roof, it started in Detroit. And it became a point of honor. But that transition was very interesting. Yeah.
Quick question. I'm wondering, didn't Henry Ford eventually renounce his anti-Semitism? I think there's a letter in the B'nai B'rith building here. So he did renounce it. Was that deep-seated, or was it just?
No, there's a whole book called Henry Ford and the Jews. You can read this in exquisite detail for 300 pages. He was under a lot of pressure.
I see.
By 1927.
It was economic mainly.
Partly, and then his family, who were started to get on his case, like, isn't it a shame, we don't do this anymore, kind of thing. And he never, I don't think. No, after that he went off and shook hands with Hitler, and after the 30s, I mean, no, the guy did not change his spots, but he yanked the funding and the overt, publication stuff that he had.
Were children more?
Yeah, the children were they were kind of compensating, but no Jew in Detroit bought a Ford.
Gosh.
Nobody ever drove a Ford. Always GM cars, Chrysler, anything else. We never bought a Ford.
Were there any Jewish automobiles, by the way?
No. What the Jews did, everybody else worked on the assembly line. The Jews didn't work on the assembly line. I have the statistics for this. The Jews were the managerial group. Emma Shaver's husband, Morris, how did he make his money? Uniforms, laundry for the auto industry, scrap iron, supplying mattresses you cannot imagine what these people did, anything but working on the assembly.
The Yiddish company made a lot of money.
Yeah.
They were also engineers, weren't they?
And engineers, but they couldn't rise. They couldn't rise in the auto company. But the main figure is Albert Kahn, who built everything, who built the greatest factories, and half of Detroit and half of the buildings, University of Michigan I went to, were all done by Albert Kahn. These were these German Jews. And he was an amazing historic figure. As a Jew, he was able to get away with it because Ford, he could deliver for Ford what he needed. which were the modern extraordinary factory system. So
In my family, there was a myth that my grandfather, whose name was John Fisher, worked for a very short time in the 30s on the Ford assembly line. When they found out he was Jewish, he no longer worked on the assembly line.
Yeah.
And then when my father moved to Detroit after World War II as an engineer, he was able to work at Chrysler,
Right.
but not able to work
Okay,
at
still.
Ford.
Still.
And then it took him a while to work at Ford.
Yeah, eventually they kind of came around. But it's very complicated.
I actually don't have a question, I just want to make a comment about
what?
The song.
I grew up in Montreal, and I grew up in a survivor community. And I went to a Jewish school, Hebrew day school. And every year, we had an assembly, I don't know which day it was, I don't remember. And we sang that song, and they had the students, including me, march all around the auditorium. And it was sung in that declamatory style.
Yeah, well, that happened everywhere. I mean, that is the anthem of the.
No, but it was that style.
And that style. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. That was I went to Cass Tech. Well, my father taught at Mumford, but he was a teacher at Mumford. Yeah, Cass Tech was it was one magnet school for the whole city of Detroit. It was 8 stories high and several blocks. And you could study automotive and air conditioning, or you could be in the music program, which produced future concertmasters of America, or in the art department. It was an amazing school. I was very lucky to work in that school.
My dad told me that Father Coughlin, broadcasting from Detroit, I've been all over Michigan. He said that it was on CBS radio in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s.
The Catholic Church never shut him down. It was the U.S. government that shut him down after the war. He was allowed to do this every week. This is horrifying when you think about it.
He also said there were just as many Italian
You
members
needed a woman or
of
something.
Father Coughlin's German.
The Catholics are Catholics.
His Irish.
Catholics are Catholics in that sense. And Detroit was very heavily. I mean, there were 1.8 million people at the height within the city limits. 350,000 of them were Poles, and then there was Irish, and then it was Italians, and so it was very, very heavily Catholic. And, yeah. Okay.
I explain to people that Detroit is the most southern city that you'll find in North America.
Right. Because Canada is south of Detroit.
Right, and it's very hard for people who didn't grow up in Detroit to understand how southern it is, given the mix of people that are there.
Well, I mean, geographically it is very odd. We always have a good time with that, saying we're going south of the border to Canada, and nobody says, what? Where's the city in America where you go south of the border to Canada? Everybody says it's not possible, but it's Detroit. Because there's a little peninsula that comes around. In winter, it's across the border. Yes, I mean, there were these hundreds of thousands of black and white people from the South that came to Detroit. Later, it was the last wave almost of the Great Migration, because the Great Migration starts earlier to Chicago and these other places, and blacks are very well established there and have their own entertainment industries. 50 years before almost, or 40 years before the Detroit, where you get an organized black entertainment in Detroit. It's really a very different story of newcomer. The city is almost nothing. It's very insignificant till 1910. In 1970, it's over.
Yeah.
So we're talking 3 generations, 60 years, when it becomes capital of the 20th century, 4th largest city. And that happens to be the window where I experienced the place.
What brought your father's family to Detroit?
My father, well, it's a good story. I mean, his father, his mother was born in Detroit on the way, in 1890, in New York, and then they got, it's usually family connections. But my father's father, he he went to London first from England first, and then we couldn't find him on the ship manifest and stuff because he came down the St. Lawrence River from Canada first, not through New York. So that was a little, and he ends up in Rosebush, Michigan, which nobody has ever heard of who lives in Michigan. It's a place of 200 or 300 people. And of course, in the typical fashion, well, you should all read Hasia Diner's book called Roads Taken, about the history of the Jewish peddler, which covers Rhodesia and Australia and Buenos Aires and Detroit. Jewish peddlers were everywhere. So he was one of those, and then you make a dry goods store. Then you want to get out of Rosebush. You go to Bay City, which was the bigger town, in the hopes of getting to Detroit, which he eventually did. And he meets this American-born girl in Bay City, and it's upward mobility. My brother's done a really nice family history of all this, and he's translated the postcards and letters from Yiddish and stuff, and it's really fun reading. Yeah. Sorry.
You mentioned
No, it's,
the
I always
downfall.
I always need the mic.
You mentioned the downfall of Detroit in the '70s after the first oil embargo, but then something happened and developers tried to bring back Detroit and they create the Renaissance.
Yeah, totally.
And it,
Yeah.
any comment on that?
I mean, the story's not about the oil embargo. The story's about disinvestment. Even in the 20s, Ford already was writing to his people that they should move some of the factories out of Detroit. And then once the unions succeeded in establishing, the United Auto Workers came in the late 30s and won, more incentive to move the work away. So they very stealthily started moving stuff, taking pieces on the chessboard capital. They started moving the pieces other places. Flint first, Youngstown, then eventually to the American South, and eventually to Mexico or whatever, to keep labor costs down. So that was happening. And then, of course, yes, the Japanese came in with their little cars, and the Americans were arrogant and didn't understand, and they ruled the industry in every way you can imagine. And it was very sad. Because of the boundary of Detroit was 139 square miles in the city limits. But there's all those extra, parts out beyond it, because you just go out and out as long as you like from Detroit. What got left in the city, because the blacks were not allowed to get mortgages and move out, that was federally supported by the Supreme Court, and because they were thrown into public housing, and because they paved over the black entertainment district where Kenny Burrell and Yusuf Lateef and Tommy Flanagan and Barry Harris played. They paved it over to make the Chrysler Freeway. So there was no black center anymore, no small enterprise. Barry Gordy's the one guy who figured out how to get out of that situation to make an industry that was not, that he could build. But anyway, that's a long story. So the ruin of the city is a complicated set of issues that have to do with the logic of capitalism, the logic of racism, basically, and the shifts in the American economy in general.
Maybe a little less relevant, but if you'll remember back in the 50s, we had the threat of nuclear war.
Right.
And I was told that GM actually led the disinvestment of factories out of the Detroit area to move their factories in case there were ever nuclear attacks. In one place, their factories were able to function. In other places, Ohio,
Yeah, I
and
never
other
heard that.
places in the Midwest.
I haven't heard that. There's almost no good books to read about Detroit in this period. It's unbelievable. This is a major world city. And I said, I'll read all the good books on Detroit, and there's like 3.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. And the one really good book by Thomas Segru, he's the one who details all this. And Segru, I not remember Segru mentioning this. He talks about the economic, issues rather than the nuclear issues. Right.
I have a friend who lived in one of the suburbs, I think Southfield, yeah. And he told me that the auto industry lobbied so that they were able to prevent the development of any kind of mass transit, and that Detroit was the only major city that didn't have effective mass transit.
No, Detroit had excellent mass transit. They bought it up and trashed it, and they did the same thing to LA. They bought up the LA bus system and trashed it, GM.
And New York and Brooklyn.
And no, there was an excellent mass transit system. In my day, I got on the bus and went down, it was wonderful. And they said, no, we don't want this, we're building freeways. They're gonna have to use, it's the oil industry, the tire and rubber industry, anyway, but we're talking about music, so let's not go farther afield into such matters. One more question back here, then maybe wrap up.
Can you talk a little about the development of Jewish suburbs and redlining?
But we're not in an urban studies class here. Yeah.
I think that the stories you tell are terrific, but they're very just mostly family oriented. It makes it sound like the Jewish community was so insular. And it didn't get out.
I just told 12 examples of outreach and how they did things with every other group in Detroit, so I'm sorry you didn't catch that.
No, it felt as if there were 90,000 Jews in Detroit, and they all stayed together. And nobody went out to listen to popular music. Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, Jews.
We talked about that. Yes.
I didn't hear it.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. No, they did. They went out. They listened to other things, and they brought them in for dances. I said the Social and Life Institute brought Panchito's Latin band to play their gigs. They were constantly listening to other trends too. Yeah. They had the internal life. They had this outreach where they performed with every other group in Detroit in choruses and then they went. Of course, they listened to everything. I mean. Sure. Who were the audience in the nightclubs? I mean, Jews alongside everybody else who had good taste in music. Yeah. And Detroit was an incredible music city. I mean, the number of great musicians that came out in the jazz world and the R&B world and so forth before Motown.
Is it
Really
still?
phenomenal.
Is it still?
No, there's not much music in Detroit anymore. I'd be going back and doing field work there now if there were really a great music scene. But although you have this great gentrification of a couple of zones in Detroit and a lot of small-time entrepreneurship building up and things like that, musically, meh. No, there's not a lot happening. Sorry, maybe one more is back there.
Can you comment a little bit on the relationship between Detroit and the Catskills? Musical.
Actually, I've never run into any specific connection to Detroit and the Catskills. It must be there somewhere. I mean, the Detroit Jewish News would comment on these things, like national trends and stuff. But no, Detroiters went north, or they went towards Chicago, where it was a provincial place between Chicago and New York. Of course, there's a New York connection, but Detroit's way farther. New York is farther. Chicago is closer, and like Michigan, we went every summer up north to the lakes. You went to the lakes towards Lake Michigan or wherever the lake you could afford, and you could rent a cottage. And we were Midwesterners, pretty much.
I just want to say Glenn Fry is from Detroit,
Yes.
and so is Bob Seger.
Yeah, that's the.
There are musicians not Jewish, but
Of course.
to me the music, I'm with respect, and I'm learning from you, but the music scene is very interesting from Midwestern. I mean, Cleveland has Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, so there's that, the Guy Free. But Detroit produced some great musicians.
Well, as I said, yeah. And so you have the period in the 60s and early 70s of those guys.
Yeah.
Then you have the invention of techno.
Yes.
Techno comes from these black and Hispanic kids living in a white suburb in Detroit. I mean, it's like strange, but that's another story about this traffic. Like they could flow into the city, and all these kids like that came from the suburbs, like the kids from the MC5, or although they were not necessarily native Detroiters, they came in for the scene, and then they became, then they left Detroit. So most musicians left the city. They went to where the real work was, the real money was. New York, Chicago, maybe LA. And then this ends with, the line ends with Jack White and Eminem around 2000. And after that, there's no real Detroit music of any consequence.
Aretha stayed.
And well,
That's right.
she's from an earlier period. Yeah. Okay, it's probably enough time. But you can all buy books too.